And we're into the last topic of this course, which is monopolies. So monopolies, we've talked about them. We're going to actually now go much more into depth. Monopolies are the key example and the prime example of why less competition creates social inefficiencies. So, have any of you thought why Starbucks at airports are so expensive?
Because customers don't have a choice.
Exactly. Or at least they have fewer choices. Like once you pass security at an airport, what happens is that you have a limited number of options because first of all, you can't pass liquids like a big bottle of water through the security checkpoint. And once you're there, if you're thirsty, you have like really limited options. Either you are part of a lounge like from like American Express or something in which you have like food, or you need to buy it. And the number of options within the like the gates of the airport tend to be limited. They can be just a handful. And when I mean a handful, they may be 10 options, literally, like from all the different like fast food type options. And before the security checkpoint, you could have bought that coffee anywhere, like in literally any store that you passed along the way. So because of a lack of competition, you have different prices. And those prices are higher because to be there, to be at that point, to have a store within the gates is expensive to those firms because the airport management is charging them money. So because they have higher costs, they have to recuperate more and they will charge you more. But in general, as you can see from this, I really like this table. It's like 4 or 5 years old, but I don't care because it's like so insightful into like the different competition levels in the different airports. You have a bunch of USA airports, and as you can see, the cost of different things varies wildly between them, and also it varies between the cost of that same item within the gates or after the security checkpoint and before, like in the city, the average price of the city. And I really like this because there are different restrictions and you can see how it's much more expensive. The same thing applies to the McDonald's Big Mac. Another thing that you can easily compare to many locations outside the airport or 7-Elevens or Starbucks. And yes, the point is that with less competition, prices are higher. And prices are higher because you don't have to compete. So let's quickly recall a couple of the things that constitute competitive markets. The main assumptions that we did, remember, they were that economic agents, where they were consumers, there are many, many consumers, and producers. In competitive markets, there are many firms producing the same type of good. So what happens here is that they become price takers. And price takers, to refresh your memory, are economic agents, whether they are consumers or producers, that because they are so small relative to the entire market, they can't affect the price. Your consumption decisions as a consumer are so small regarding the market that if you don't buy any unit at all, it doesn't affect the price. No one cares because the effect is so small, it's basically negligible. And also, the same thing happens with producers. If there's many competitors and one of them goes broke or can't participate that year or whatever the reason, it probably doesn't affect the market almost or at all, and therefore they become price takers. That people have perfect information, that there's no transaction cost, things that we discussed like 2 classes ago, and their products are homogeneous. That essentially, it's very hard for consumers to distinguish between brands. They become so similar that unless you have really specific taste, you can distinguish between elotes verdes and elotes la costeña, between the corn of 2 different producers. And the welfare theorems that we discussed a couple of classes ago are some of the results regarding this idea of competitive equilibriums. So once we move away from the competitive equilibriums, we find on the opposite side of the spectrum, the opposite, the extreme case, is monopoly. And the monopoly, as you well know, is a firm which is the sole supplier of a good within a particular market. Some monopolies are generated by legal reasons. If someone finds a or has a patent, think of all the different pharmaceutical laboratories and in general the pharmaceutical firms which are racing to find a vaccine for the COVID-19 pandemic. The first one that finds it will like to capitalize on their investment, and they should be able to do so. They invested a lot of money probably into this research. So there are legal ways to be the only the only firm that can produce a specific thing. And depending on the type of industry, depending on the type of country, the length of those patents varies. And the longer the patent, the higher the price normally becomes of those goods. So it's a thing that has to be balanced because if not, a good which could be useful to society becomes really expensive and prohibitive for many people. Other monopolies are formed because of natural progression of the market. We discussed briefly a couple of classes ago the idea of economies of scale. Certain industries for which, as they increase the volume of production or the scope of their services, every new additional unit they put in the market becomes so small with regards that the added costs become so small with regards to the initial investment that they can basically have economies of scale, which means that their average cost of production decreases with quantity instead of increase, which was the case we reviewed in our examples when we saw cost functions. Think of network television, or a great example actually is through network television, the broadcasting of a specific team. For example, probably a lot of you are fans of Barcelona Football Club or Real Madrid Football Club. And those two teams are globally recognized. And they have like fantastic players, and the Clásico is like the most watched game normally every year, aside like from the Champions League final. So what happens there is that for someone that holds the rights to broadcast those teams, or at least the games of those teams, paying the initial cost of like having the rights to broadcast is probably really expensive. But once you have them and you pay that initial investment, that initial cost, reaching newer markets in the Middle East, in Asia, in South America, and wherever becomes so basically so small relative to the original investment that you can reach higher people that way, and obviously you can charge by reaching those people and recuperate really quickly those costs. There is a fantastic paper from like 15 years ago regarding the economics of superstars and why since like the early 2000s the salaries of like superstar athletes in different sports, in basketball and soccer or football, in different type of sports, they became so high because for a club, it is so important to secure this great athlete like Lionel Messi or like Cristiano Ronaldo when he was playing for Real Madrid, because they become a magnet of revenues. Because when they are on the field, they create this spectacle that allows basically millions to be delighted, and they can charge a lot for those broadcasting rights that are so much bigger than the actual cost of the player and in general of the players, that reaching those farther and farther away markets in Africa, in Asia, like in very remote places, is worth it because you recuperate a lot of those costs, and that's why you can pay the exorbitant amount of money that those athletes receive. And those type of industries tend to become monopolies. So this applies to network television. This applies obviously to Netflix when it appeared. This applies to railways, to the electricity sector, like the transmission lines. This applies to natural gas pipelines and different markets or industries in which expanding the output, reaching more customers becomes simpler and simpler once you paid the initial cost. Not everyone can invest in having their own TV station. It's like really expensive. But once you have it, reaching farther away from where you are, it's not that expensive. So that the initial cost is a huge barrier to entry, and therefore it tends to create only a couple of players, and that natural progression of the market creates economies of scale. Questions on what a monopoly is. So basically, to describe monopolies, we need to see to four basic characteristics. One, asymmetric information. Because they're the only supplier of this good, they have all the information of how it is produced within the firm, and they know the quality of the products. And for consumers, it's really hard to gauge the difference in quality because they don't have alternatives to compare them with. So think of when there was only one telephone company in Mexico. You were obviously not born yet, but like 30 years ago or 40 years ago, it was very hard for consumers to know what was a better service than Telmex if they had never seen another service. So this asymmetries of information makes it really hard to basically complain and in general demand better quality because you've never seen this. Like this is the North Korean type way of doing things. Like it's hard to understand that there are other alternatives if you have never seen them. That's why authoritarian governments tend to censor information so much, so that people don't see the alternatives to their crappy state. That's one of them. Market power. Obviously, monopolies have a lot of market power because they are the only firm in that industry. Or even in situations in which you don't have a monopoly, but you have a duopoly or an oligopoly, which you have just a handful of firms. Those firms are so big that they exercise important power within their industries. A great example is Disney Studios. Disney Studios holds right now more or less 39 to 40% of the entire cinema market. And when you count them in terms of revenues and how much their movies make, it's much higher than that. So think of why, if you are a monopoly, you can just make like 8 movies a year and essentially just make the same movies all over or again, like The Lion King is literally the same movie from like 1994, but now in live action, basically CG. And it's a very crappy movie, actually. The original is much better, but it made $1.7 billion in the global box office because people don't really understand that there could be better products from Disney if they basically had to compete more with the other studios. When they have huge market power, you can also leverage your suppliers or your consumers upward on the supply chain or downward on the supply chain. Think of how if you own Star Wars and everyone wants to see the last movie of Star Wars, you can pressure the cinemas telling them, I want full revenue on the first opening weekend when most people are gonna see my movie. If you don't agree to my terms, you can't. I will basically not give you the film, and you will lose a lot of money because they will go with the other cinemas across the street or across town, and there they will be able to see Star Wars. So you become so powerful that you can basically strong arm a lot of firms. That's what Walmart does all the time. So that market power allows you to change overall prices of your costs, in terms of the inputs, and also on the amount of money your customers will be able or will have to pay for this. Negative externalities. I more or less discussed this in the idea that they tend to negatively affect other processes down the supply chain. The example with the cinemas is clear. And obviously, a key concept for monopolies are barriers to entry. There may be different things that create barriers to entry. Some of them are legal, like when the government decides to basically prohibit the renewable energies, or when the initial investment and the initial costs of production, those fixed costs are so big, only a handful of players can actually enter that type of market. That is a little bit why certain some of these network type industries are so expensive to enter, that you don't have like, it's not easy to just create a new oil firm. Like, it's really hard. It's not only by the technical expertise you need in terms of the engineers, but also the initial like endowment that you need to basically start a a big oil firm. Like, it's very, very expensive. So those barriers to entry, where they are legal or natural, allow the firms that are now the incumbent firms that exist in the market to basically be the dominant players. Those are the main characteristics of monopolies.